An ABC News exclusive, a unique look inside Camelot. The story is told by the First Lady about her husband, the President. The details are in those never-before-released tapes made by Jacqueline Kennedy just 4 months after John F. Kennedy's assassination.
For 60 years, two men stood close enough to touch the most photographed woman in America, and for 60 years, they said almost nothing. They watched Jacqueline Kennedy smile for the cameras while she was falling apart in private. They watched her kneel on a hospital floor and pray over her dying husband. One of them carried a piece of physical evidence in his pocket that could rewrite the official story of the assassination, and he told almost no one for 6 decades. This is the story of what Jackie Kennedy's own bodyguard saw, why they stayed silent for half a century, and what finally made them talk. Before she was First Lady, Jacqueline Bouvier was a young journalist in Washington, working as an inquiring photographer for a local newspaper, the kind of job that had her walking the streets asking strangers questions and snapping their pictures. She was sharp, well-traveled, and fluent in French, and she had no idea that a young congressman named John F. Kennedy would soon change the entire direction of her life. They married in 1953 in a wedding so large it practically shut down the town of Newport, Rhode Island, and within a decade she was standing beside him as he took the oath of office as the 35th President of the United States. She brought 2 small children into the White House, Caroline and John Jr., and for the first time since Theodore Roosevelt's era, the country had young kids running through the halls of the executive mansion. Reporters loved it. Photographers couldn't get enough of it. And a nickname stuck to the whole era, borrowed from a Broadway musical, Camelot. It was the image of a golden American family, effortless and glamorous. But glamour is easy to fake for a camera. It is much harder to fake for the man standing 3 feet away with a radio earpiece and a loaded weapon. That man was Clint Hill, a Secret Service agent from North Dakota who had served under President Eisenhower before being reassigned in late 1960 to protect the incoming First Lady. By his own account in later interviews, Hill was not thrilled about the assignment at first. Presidential protection was considered the prestige posting inside the service. Guarding a First Lady, especially one who reportedly disliked the constant presence of agents, felt like a lesser job. Jacqueline Kennedy valued her privacy fiercely and initially tried to keep her security detail at arm's length, preferring to slip out for walks or errands without an entourage trailing her. Hill later said that in the early weeks of the assignment, he genuinely wondered whether he had been sidelined into a quiet, low-stakes post while his peers competed for the more prestigious rotations protecting the president himself. But something changed over the following months. Hill was assigned to accompany her on a demanding overseas trip to India and Pakistan in 1962, days filled with heat, crowds, and a punishing schedule. And out of that shared grind came an unusual professional trust. The trip was physically brutal, packed with public appearances, long motorcades through unfamiliar cities, and constant improvisation, and Hill later described it as the moment their working relationship shifted from formal to genuinely personal. He learned to read her exhaustion before she voiced it, to anticipate which crowds made her uneasy, and to run interference with reporters who pushed too close. He wasn't just walking a few paces behind her for photographs. He was the person tasked with keeping her safe in a role that came with very real threats, and over time he became someone she genuinely relied on, not just as a bodyguard but as one of the few people around her whose job didn't depend on flattering her or managing her image for political benefit. That distinction mattered more than it might sound. Everyone else surrounding the First Lady in those years, aides, advisors, even friends drawn into the political orbit of the Kennedy White House, had some stake in how she was perceived publicly. Hill's job was different. His success was measured by whether she stayed safe, not by whether she looked a certain way doing it, and that gave him a vantage point almost nobody else in her life had. He could see her tired, irritated, frightened, or simply bored, without any of it needing to become part of the carefully managed Camelot narrative. A second agent entered this tight circle not long after, Paul Landis, a young agent assigned specifically to protect the Kennedy children. Landis's job put him inside the domestic, unscripted moments of the family's daily life, the ordinary friction and noise that never made it into the magazine spreads. He saw a household, not a postcard. And in the summer of 1963, that household absorbed a devastating loss. Jacqueline Kennedy gave birth prematurely to a son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, who lived only 2 days before dying of a lung condition common in premature infants at the time. It was a private tragedy playing out in a hospital, largely shielded from the press, but the agents assigned to the family were there for it, close enough to see the toll it took on both parents. Grief like that doesn't disappear because a family has a public image to maintain. It just goes underground, and the people standing closest to the family carried the memory of it long after the cameras moved on. By the fall of 1963, the political calendar was pulling the Kennedys toward Texas, a state where the president's approval numbers were shaky and where tensions inside the Democratic Party were running hot. There had been ugly incidents involving other officials in Dallas in the recent past, enough that some in the administration were uneasy about the trip. But the visit was seen as politically necessary, a chance to smooth over party divisions ahead of the 1964 campaign, and so the motorcade route through downtown Dallas was finalized. Nobody involved in planning that day believed they were sending the president into a fatal trap. Hindsight makes threats look obvious that, at the time, were treated as background noise in a job that was full of background noise. Then came November 22, 1963. The motorcade rolled through Dealey Plaza to enormous, cheering crowds, an open-top convertible carrying the president and first lady with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife riding just ahead of them. Then, in the space of about 6 seconds, gunfire erupted from the direction of the Texas School Book Depository. Most people in the crowd didn't immediately register what they were hearing. Some later said it sounded like fireworks or a backfiring engine. Clint Hill, riding on the running board of the follow-up car directly behind the president's limousine, reacted almost instantly. He jumped down and sprinted toward the accelerating car, one of the only people in that chaotic scene who moved toward the danger instead of away from it. He has said in later interviews and in his own memoirs that if he had been a half-second faster off that running board, he might have reached the vehicle before the fatal shot. He carried that belief, fair or not, for the rest of his life. What Hill saw as he threw himself onto the trunk of the moving limousine has become one of the defining images of that day. Jacqueline Kennedy had climbed partway onto the back of the car, reaching toward something on the trunk. Accounts differ on exactly what was going through her mind in that instant of shock, and Hill himself pushed her back down into the seat and covered both her and the president with his own body as the driver floored the accelerator toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. That photograph of Hill spread across the back of the car became one of the era's most reproduced news images, and for the rest of his life, strangers recognized him as the man who climbed onto the president's car. A label he said in interviews he never felt comfortable wearing as some kind of honor, because in his mind, he had still failed to prevent the shooting. The drive to Parkland lasted only a few minutes, but Hill described it in later years as feeling endless, the wind and the speed and the knowledge that there was nothing left for him to do but hold on and shield the people in the back seat with his own body. He was still lying across the trunk when the car finally screeched to a stop outside the emergency entrance, and by his own account, the first thing he registered clearly was the president's condition, and the second was Jacqueline Kennedy's silence. She wasn't screaming or sobbing. She had gone almost completely still, and that stillness, Hill said, worried him more than any outburst would have. Inside that same speeding car, Paul Landis noticed something else entirely: a bullet, nearly undamaged, resting on the upholstery of the back seat. According to Landis's own account, published decades later, he was worried that in the chaos at the hospital a bystander or souvenir hunter might grab it, so he pocketed it himself, intending to hand it over to the appropriate authorities. What happened next is where his story becomes genuinely significant to history. By his telling, in the pandemonium inside Parkland's trauma room, he set the bullet down near the president on a gurney, hoping it would be treated as evidence connected to Kennedy's wounds. That bullet was later recovered near Governor Connally's stretcher and became known to history as the so-called magic bullet, the single round that the Warren Commission concluded passed through both Kennedy and Connally to explain the timing of the shots. For 60 years, the official record listed that bullet as having come from Connally's gurney. Landis says it never came from Connally's side of the car at all. It came from the back seat, near the president. Inside Parkland's Trauma Room 1, the scene was overwhelming. Doctors and nurses worked over the president while Jacqueline Kennedy stood against the wall, refusing repeated requests from hospital staff to step out into the hallway. Hill and Landis positioned themselves near her, less to physically restrain anyone and more to create a buffer between her and the growing crowd of staff, clergy, and officials moving in and out of the room. By multiple later accounts, she eventually moved close enough to the table to be near her husband as the medical staff worked, and she remained there, largely silent, until doctors confirmed there was nothing more they could do. It was in that same stretch of chaos and grief that Landis says he made the decision to set the bullet down near the president rather than immediately hand it to an official, a choice he has since called a mistake but one made, in his telling, in a room where almost nobody was thinking clearly. This detail matters because the entire single-bullet explanation was the load-bearing wall of the Warren Commission's conclusion that one gunman, acting alone, could have fired all the shots in the available time. If Landis's memory is accurate, the bullet's origin point changes, and that reopens debate about whether the shots could have come from a single shooter using a bolt-action rifle in that narrow window. It's important to be fair here. Landis has said publicly that he still personally believes Lee Harvey Oswald was the shooter, and he has not claimed to have proof of a second gunman. Some assassination researchers and journalists who have studied his account for years find it credible and are troubled that the Warren Commission never formally interviewed him. Others, including people who covered the case in the 1970s, have publicly expressed skepticism about a decades-old memory being treated as settled fact. What's not in dispute is that Landis, for reasons he has attributed to trauma, guilt, and the simple passage of time, did not share this account with investigators in 1964, and it did not surface publicly until his 2023 memoir, nearly 60 years after the assassination. Landis has explained his long silence in fairly human terms. He was in his mid-20s in 1963, assigned to one of the most famous families on Earth, and then abruptly present for the single most traumatic public event of his generation. He resigned from the Secret Service within a year of the assassination, still in his 20s, and by his own description spent decades trying not to think about Dallas at all rather than trying to preserve details for history. It wasn't a calculated cover-up. By his account, it was more like a wound he avoided touching for as long as he possibly could. It took the 60th anniversary of the assassination, and encouragement from people close to him, before he finally sat down and worked through what he remembered with a historian's help, ultimately publishing his account as a memoir titled The Final Witness. Clint Hill's silence took a different shape. He didn't hide a piece of evidence, he hid himself. In the years following the assassination, Hill continued serving in the Secret Service, eventually working details for President Lyndon Johnson and then rising to assistant director of the agency. But according to his own later accounts, he never stopped replaying those 6 seconds in Dallas. He said publicly that he fell into a severe depression, that he leaned on alcohol and cigarettes to get through sleepless nights, and that the guilt of believing he could have reacted faster ate away at him for years. He retired from the Secret Service in 1975, in his early 40s, on the recommendation of his doctors. That same year, he gave a raw, emotional television interview in which he broke down describing his belief that he had failed to save the president. For a long stretch afterward, he mostly avoided talking about the assassination at all. It wasn't until much later in his life, decades on, after remarrying and, by his own description, finally finding some peace, that Hill opened up more fully, co-writing several memoirs about his years protecting Jacqueline Kennedy and the wider Kennedy family. In those books and in interviews given around the 50th and 60th anniversaries of the assassination, he described in detail the woman the public rarely got to see, someone who was warm and funny in private, fiercely protective of her children's normalcy, and, in the days after Dallas, someone enduring a grief so total that professional distance became almost impossible to maintain. He described how she resisted friends and aides who urged her to change out of her blood-stained pink suit on the flight back to Washington, reportedly saying she wanted people to see exactly what had been done to her husband. Whether or not those were her precise words, the broader point Hill and others close to the family made repeatedly is the same. Her composure at the funeral a few days later, so widely admired around the world, was not the absence of pain. It was pain that she had decided, deliberately, to carry in public on her own terms.